All right, it's 1:30, so I think I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for your interest in this webinar. I'm Christine Keenest, for those of you that I have not met. I'm the Employee Relations Manager in HR, and I'm just trying to get myself situated here, so sorry. So we're here to talk today about corrective and adverse actions. So just a couple of quick disclaimers you can see after the start information on here. The corrective and adverse actions process we have does not currently apply to employees of the Sheriff's Office. The Sheriff's Office has their own set of policies and their own procedures that they follow. They do look fairly similar, and they do use some of the templates that I'll talk about for the most part, but otherwise they kind of have their own thing. So if you work in the Sheriff's Office and this doesn't look exactly like your process, that's why. And then it also does not apply to any appointed officials. So for the most part, that's going to be your department heads, but it also is some who are kind of considered division heads. If you're curious whether or not you're considered appointed, there is an Appendix A on the website that can tell you whether or not your job falls under that. It does also include any attorney jobs. So the district attorney's office and county attorney's office attorneys would not be subject to this policy. And the reason is they're considered to be at will. And so we don't formally follow this process or these procedures for those employees. And then of course, it does not apply to our elected officials. They report to the voters. The voters are the only ones who can remove them from office or anything like that. So it does not apply to them either. All right. So this is just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll first talk about our corrective actions and sort of the purpose of a corrective action and the process that we go through. And then paired with the corrective actions is the problem-solving process. So if an employee objects to or has an issue with a corrective action or their performance evaluation, they have an opportunity to use our problem-solving process to address that and to give feedback and to share their perspective. And then we'll talk a little bit about adverse actions. What is the purpose of an adverse action and what does that process look like? And then finally, we talk about grievances, which grievances are paired with adverse actions. And they're essentially kind of an appeal from an adverse action process. So we'll talk about all of those today. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Please just enter those into the chat, and then Jen will be monitoring those for me, and we'll talk about any questions that you all have at the end. So, as those questions occur to you as I'm talking, please feel free to just type them into the chat, and then we'll get to them a little bit later on. And then I'll also mention, we originally thought of teaching this webinar to just supervisors, since they are the ones who go through this process or initiate this process or things like that. But then we started talking and realized, why not share it with employees? Because sometimes this is kind of a mystery. And so we wanted to demystify the process for everyone. So if you are an employee and not a supervisor, or if you have any employees that are curious about the process, they are completely welcome to watch this webinar. We'll be recording it and sharing it on the HR website. So you should see it probably next week. It will be at larimer.org/HR, just shared on the employee relations page. So that information will be available to any of you to watch at a future date as well. All right. So before we hop into the processes, I wanted to share the journal entries function in Perform with you. So hopefully all of you have been in Perform working on your performance evaluations. Whether you're an employee or a supervisor, you should have gone through at least one of them by now. One of our favorite features in that Perform suite of, options is the journal entry function. There are a few different ways you can get into it. So you can get into it from your unified dashboard, which is the one that you log into initially, or if you click into Perform itself, it's also in there. It's pretty easy to just click on any of your employees if you're a supervisor, and it'll pull out this little wing out that you see on the screenshot and show you what it looks like. You can also type in an employee's name if you just go into the Journal Hub, which is usually in the upper right-hand corner, and then it'll pull them up. So if you have any questions at all about journal entries, how to get to them, there's some videos on the Employee Relations website, and you're also welcome to contact any member of the Perform team, especially Marcy Hamilton or Lisa Wempen, and they will gladly set a quick meeting with you to walk you through anything. But the reason I wanted to call it journal entries is they're super simple to use and they interface really nicely with the performance evaluation process. So as you can see from the screenshot there, it has kind of a word-like feel to it. So you can attach documents, you can have bulleted lists or numbered lists, you can bold and underline all those things. So what is it useful for? Journal entry is just a great way to kind of document ongoing conversations. So in HR, we use them for all of our regular check-in meetings. So we really encourage supervisors to check in regularly with employees. Some of them will meet quarterly, some monthly, some more often. So within HR, anytime we have those regular check-ins, we just document the check-in within a journal entry. And then you can share a journal entry with, so if you enter it, you will be able to always see it. You can also check who else it is visible to. So if you're a supervisor, you could make it visible to the employee or not. If you're an employee, you can enter notes just for yourself and potentially make it visible to a supervisor or your supervisor's supervisor. So you can share those kind of check-in notes so that both of you have access to them and you know what everyone's working on and what you've discussed. It's also a great way to share kudos. So you can cut and paste information from Nectar in there. So as an employee, if you want to share with your supervisor or even your supervisor's supervisor, a great shout out you got on Nectar about something, you can copy and paste that into this and share it easily. So it's a cool way to do that. It's also an easy way for supervisors to follow up after a meeting with an employee, especially if you've discussed something, maybe a performance issue, and it's not something that you've gone to, you know, a more formal documented corrective action process. It really is just, hey, I noticed you were late twice in the last week. Then instead of, you know, a lot of times supervisors will follow up with like an email saying, hey, we met on June 6th, and this is what we talked about, and you said you're not going to be late anymore, blah, 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 and you send it. Instead of doing that, you can actually just do a journal entry, and then it will be saved in the system, and it's easy to go back and see that. And then it's also easy to cut and paste journal entries into performance evaluations if needed. So there's a lot of cool functionality with this and a lot of things you can do with it. You can provide clarifications to employees, clarify expectations, things like that. So again, if you have questions about that, just feel free to reach out to your generalist or to the Perform team. All right, so an overview of corrective actions. So the overall goal in a corrective action is truly corrective. So we don't mean for corrective actions to be punitive. The goal is to set out performance expectations or behavior expectations that are not being met, and then make it clear to the employee exactly what it is that's not being met, and then hopefully realign performance expectations with what we're seeing from the employee. So like I said, they're not meant to be punitive. They really are to call an employee's attention to behavior or performance that is a problem, and then make it clear to them what needs to be corrected and changed. There should always be a statement in there about support and resources we can offer. So it might be additional training. It might be, you know, if you have an FTO or training program, setting them up with a trainer for some remedial sessions. It could be having them do a LinkedIn learning training if it's a behavioral thing on better customer service skills or better communication skills. So there's a lot of different support and resources we can offer for employees to help support that change in their behavior or performance. And then also just clarify expectations. You know, the employee may not be clear on what's expected of them. So the corrective action is really to make that abundantly clear to them. So again, they can change. The goal is always to try and retain an employee if we can, because it's really in everyone's best interest. If we can turn someone around and keep them as a solid employee, that helps the county and it helps the employee themselves. So a corrective action, I'll first mention the county doesn't have a progressive discipline policy. So some of you may have worked at prior employers who have progressive discipline, and really that means there's just sort of a set stair-step process of severity in addressing performance concerns. So you may have a situation in those cases where, you know, your first instance is a verbal counseling. Your second instance of something is a written corrective action. The third instance is a second written discipline, and then termination. So that's what you typically see in those. We don't do that because our goal is really that whatever the level of corrective action is, that it should match the severity of the issue and what's going on. And then we also have to make sure that it's consistent with what's been done in the past, so that we're being fair to employees and not treating them differently. So with a corrective action, typically a corrective action, which is a written document given to the employee, that's typically not the first action that we'll take if there's an issue of performance or behavior. Usually we'll have a couple of informal conversations with the employee that we document in our supervisor notes. And then if it continues, then we go on to corrective action. But if there is some more severe behavior, we may potentially jump straight to corrective action if that's appropriate. So if we have a situation where maybe there's some property damage, maybe somebody drove their forklift into a wall, we might jump to corrective action, even if it's the first time that employee has done it, to just underscore the seriousness of what they've done. Or if there's some maybe inappropriate, disrespectful behavior, that kind of thing, we might jump straight to a corrective action. And then if it's really severe, we can always jump straight to adverse action, which is typically we're talking about termination, but we'll talk about that later, what it entails. But we may jump straight to that adverse action if it's severe enough. So we have a zero tolerance policy for alcohol and drugs. So if someone were to show up under the influence of alcohol or drugs at work, we could potentially move to adverse action and potentially terminate that employee ultimately. Or if there's a significant sexual harassment issue, we might just jump straight to adverse action depending on the severity of that. So we don't want to be stuck in, if somebody shows up drunk to work, we don't want to be stuck with a progressive discipline policy where we have to just verbally tell them, please don't come to work drunk again. We want to really match the severity of their actions. Okay, so there's a lot of words on this slide, but I just wanted to put out there all of the reasons in policy that someone might be facing a corrective or adverse action. So there's a QR code there if you want to jump straight to the policy. It's policy 331.8, which is our corrective and adverse actions policy. So this is really just a listing of all of the different reasons that someone might be subjected to a corrective or adverse action. The top one is probably the kind of broadest category and that we see probably the most often. The bolded ones are more of the common ones. But the unsatisfactory performance can be how somebody performs their job. Maybe they're not meeting accuracy standards, or they're not meeting their, number of cases they have to process per hour, or whatever it is. That could be unsatisfactory performance, or it could also be sort of a behavioral thing where someone is not showing good customer service skills. Maybe they're being rude to customers, throwing paper at them, not being responsive to their needs, things like that. Failure to comply with a reasonable direction, not following county or your department or office's policies. Of course, there's one for misuse of leave or tardiness, absenteeism, things like that. So some of these are kind of categories that you would expect to see here. So what does the corrective action process look like? So we have just a little process map here for you. So the first step always is if a supervisor feels like a corrective action is an appropriate step to take, they should reach out to their assigned HR generalist. So each department or office has an HR generalist assigned to you. If you're not familiar with who that is, you can look it up on our website on the employee relations page. You can also call any of us and we'll help you. But essentially they contact the assigned generalist and then they'll have a discussion with the generalist about what the situation is. And the generalist will probably ask questions like, have you talked to the employee? Have you documented your conversations with the employee? How many times have you talked to the employee? Because we want to make sure that corrective action is really the appropriate action to take, and that it isn't the first time that the employee is hearing about it, unless it is one of those severe situations I mentioned. If the generalist and the supervisor decide that corrective action is appropriate, then the generalist will send a template to the supervisor and give some guidance around how to prepare that. So the template we keep in Google Docs, and we do that simply to make it easy for the supervisor and the HR generalist to collaborate back and forth. Because the generalist will be giving you some feedback on how to make the corrective action clear and easy to understand for the employee, and make sure that it's kind of tied to policy and legal reasons and things like that. So they'll collaborate back and forth on the drafting of that document. So the supervisor will start the draft, send it to the generalist. They'll kind of go back and forth. When they get a draft that they are then good with, they send it on to the county attorney's office in most cases for review, because we want to make sure that it's legal, that it's fair, and that it's clear and makes sense. Right? And then once the county attorney's office reviews it, if they recommend any changes, then the supervisor needs to go in and accept any changes recommended by the county attorney's office. And then from there, the supervisor will meet with the employee to review and present the corrective action. So it should be sort of a collaborative meeting. They should be sitting down together either in person or on Zoom. It shouldn't just be something that you email to the employee and there it is. It should really be a discussion between the employee and the supervisor. The focus of the meeting is not to be punitive. It's not we're punishing an employee for being bad. It's corrective. So that should be the emphasis and the focus of the meeting. It should be the supervisor saying, here's some guidance for you about things that you need to correct. Here's some specifics for you. And then here's how I expect you to correct that. Here's the standards that I'm looking for. Here's some resources available for you, that sort of thing. And then both of them should walk out of that meeting knowing what their responsibilities are, what's expected of them, and which one of them is going to do what. So maybe the employee leaves that meeting knowing that they will be expected to go take a LinkedIn learning training, and the supervisor knows that they need to maybe email the employee a link to that training. So they both have some action steps that they need to take. And then the supervisor and the employee both need to sign the corrective action. Signing the corrective action is simply acknowledging that the employee has received it. They don't have to agree with it. They're not saying it's right, anything like that. It's really just acknowledging that the supervisor provided them a copy. And occasionally we get employees who don't want to sign the corrective action, which is fine. We usually just make sure that they understand that you're not agreeing with it, you're just acknowledging receipt. If they're not comfortable with that, the supervisor can just sign it saying that the employee declined to sign. And then from there, the supervisor will send a copy of the signed corrective action to their HR generalist to upload to the personnel file. And that second sentence is an important note. Do not send it to your payroll rep. I know there are occasionally some things you send to your payroll rep. A corrective action should not be one of them. The reason is that we're really trying to protect employees' privacy. A payroll rep doesn't need to know if an employee is receiving a corrective action. And in fact, they don't have access to that side of Document Manager, so they won't be able to see those corrective actions. So the generalist should be the one uploading that, because it will be seen by the generalist, and then ultimately when we get Document Manager fully functional, employees and supervisors will be able to see what's in there as well. So just make sure you do not send it to your payroll rep, because we're trying to protect privacy. And I mentioned this, we really do our best to do those corrective actions in Google Docs to keep it collaborative and to get the quickest turnaround time for you. And then there's several things to consider for a corrective action. So we've kind of talked about the process and the how and the what. This is a little bit more information for you about kind of the whys and things to be looking out for, and what your generalist may be looking for as they're helping you review it. So some things to consider. The first one is conversations about the issue. So I mentioned one of the questions that the HR generalist will probably ask you is, how many conversations have you had? Have you talked with the employee about the issue? So again, this should not be the first conversation you're having about the issue unless it's a significant issue. If it's just somebody was late to work or somebody didn't meet their productivity standards for the day or the week, it should be an informal conversation. You should always document those in your supervisor notes. Every supervisor has different ways that they keep notes, and however you will do it consistently is the best way to do it. I've started keeping my supervisor notes as those journal entries in Perform. If there's something I'm not ready to share with the employee, I just don't click the box in Perform that says employee, and it won't be shared with the employee. It just can be notes that I have for myself. So I don't really have many of those, but typically I will just make a note and Perform if we're having a conversation about something. You can also keep supervisors' notes in a written journal. You could do a Word doc. There's a lot of different ways. Again, it comes back to the best way to do it is whatever's going to work best for you, and to make sure that you consistently keep your notes. The second issue that you should consider around corrective actions is timeliness. So they should happen within a really short window of time after whatever the behavior or performance issue is that comes up. So, you shouldn't be waiting a couple of months to talk to somebody about something. It really should be something that happened in the last few days or maybe at the last couple of weeks. You shouldn't be waiting until you're less busy or it's a more convenient time. Otherwise, the message that it sends to the employee is, this really wasn't important for me to address earlier. And so the employee is not getting a consistent message that, hey, this is an issue, but I sat on it for a while. And it also just doesn't feel fair to employees if they're getting a corrective action for something that happened a couple of months ago. Where I see this come up often is where there's a behavioral issue maybe that's happening, and a supervisor will just kind of sit on it and not address it because they don't quite know how to address it. They're not sure if it's a big enough issue to address, or maybe they're nervous about addressing it because they're afraid to upset the employee or seem like a jerk, whatever's going on. So it's important to not let those things build, because sometimes we'll get those calls in HR of an employee or a supervisor who has those ongoing behavioral issues, and they finally hit that point where they're fed up and they're calling us saying, oh my gosh, I'm so done with this employee. They're just constantly doing this behavioral issue that's so annoying. And then we ask that question about, have you talked to the employee? What have you said to them? And the supervisor says, I haven't talked to them about it. It's not appropriate for a corrective action if you haven't told the employee. How can the employee correct their behavior if they don't know that something is a problem? So again, don't let those things build. If you have something that you're questioning, is this a big enough deal to address with the employee? Am I being nitpicky? Am I just grumpy lately? Just run it by your HR generalist. We're happy to take those phone calls and sort of vet and screen those for you and tell you, yeah, I think you're being overly sensitive about that, or yeah, I think you should have a conversation with that employee. Other things to consider: documentation. So have you documented that in supervisor's notes, in follow-up emails to the employee, journal entries, whatever? So we typically want to see some documentation of prior conversations that you've had with the employee. And then finally, we want to make sure that you have given and are continuing to give support and direction. So the employee needs some clear direction about what behaviors need to change, and then they need to know what support that you're providing to them. So what's some of the critical content for corrective action? The first one up there is a good summary of whatever the issue is, the performance or conduct. So we should be clearly spelling out for the employee what the problem is. And if any of you have been through crucial conversations, these should be your facts, not your stories. So it should be observable behaviors that you could see with a video camera. So sometimes we get those corrective actions that a supervisor has written, and they say something like, hey, stop being rude to your customers or your fellow employees. Well, if you were receiving that, how are you going to take that? Your definition of rude may be different from the employee's. So if you think that something is rude, dial it back to what are the behaviors that are making me think that employee is being rude? Is it, the employee always has short, direct answers? Is that what feels rude? Or is it the employees constantly flipping off customers behind their backs when they walk away? What is it? Those are two different issues. And in both cases, I would just spell it out for the employee. So you should be giving examples. You should be clearly spelling out the behaviors, the thing the employee is saying or doing, so that they know exactly what it is that is the problem, and so they know what needs to be changed. And then you should also have the impact of the performance or conduct. And this, I think, is a really critical one that doesn't necessarily naturally come to mind. So the impact of the performance or conduct is important for the employee to understand why this is really an issue. Because otherwise, sometimes employees just feel like, oh, my supervisor's just picking on me, or they're just being nitpicky, or this silly little rule they're trying to enforce. But if you can clearly outline for the employee why the impact of their issue is a big deal, it will help them to understand it and sort of motivate them to correct the behavior in a lot of cases. So if you can say, you know, Joe Smith, you were 5 minutes late for work 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Here's why this is a problem. You know, for some jobs, it may not be an issue to be 5 minutes late, but, you know, Joe Smith, your job is to open the office and start greeting customers right at 8 o'clock every morning. When you open the office late, it means that our customer line gets backed up at the door, and our customers then are waiting longer, and we have longer wait times throughout the day because things get backed up. Or when you're not there to open the office at 8, then your coworker Susan has to come and open the office, and she's not getting her beginning of day duties done, and then backs up her workload for the rest of the day. And maybe Susan has to stay late at the end of the day and get overtime because she wasn't able to get all of her job tasks done since she was covering for you. So in my example, then that tells Joe why it's a problem that he's showing up 5 minutes late, because he may not think it's a big deal until he sees the impact on the office, your customers, other employees, and things like that. So it's really important for people to understand sort of the why and the impact. And I've mentioned specific examples, so you should be specifically citing incidents, or if it's a performance issue, maybe someone's not meeting quality or quantity standards, you should be citing to whatever the expectation is, and then saying, you know, on these 5 dates, you had a 70% accuracy when it should have been 80%, or you only processed 5 documents on this day when the expectation is that you process 10. So you should be able to give specific examples of what's going on. And then it's important to outline how and when change is expected. In HR, we generally encourage the phrase immediate and sustained improvement, because it signals to the employee that, hey, when you walk out the door, we expect you to change your behavior or your performance immediately. You should be changing things right away. And then not only are you going to change things right away, but you need to continue that behavior on an ongoing basis. Because sometimes people are great about changing that day or for the next week, and then they slip into their old patterns and they don't sustain the improvement. So those are really important. But if you have additional benchmarks or dates that you want someone to change, if you want to do more of a performance improvement plan style of corrective action, you should be setting maybe check-ins or dates when you expect them to meet certain performance expectations. So I expect you to get your accuracy rating up to 80% by 30 days from now, and then to 85% in another 30 days. So just make that clear for the employee what and when is expected of them. And then finally outline what role both the employee and the supervisor will have in the change. So what is the employee expected to do? How are they expected to change? And then what is the supervisor going to do to support that change? Is the supervisor going to schedule some weekly check-ins or even daily check-ins, depending on the work? Is the supervisor going to find a training for the employee or set the employee up with a trainer? So whatever each of them is going to do, it should be clearly outlined. All right, so that's about all of our information on corrective actions and what you can expect. So like I mentioned earlier, the problem-solving process is sort of paired with that corrective action process. And we provide several different avenues for employees to provide feedback or address any concerns that they have. So if an employee has concerns or disagrees with a corrective action or performance evaluation, there are two ways that they can engage in our problem-solving process. The first one is the informal process, which really means just having a conversation with their supervisor. So we encourage the employee to come prepared with talking points so that you as the supervisor can clearly understand what their concerns are. And then basically it's just a conversation between the employee and the supervisor about what those concerns are. The supervisor can change their mind based on feedback from the employee. They could, get rid of a corrective action, or they could modify it. They could, and they can also just stand by what they have. So it's totally up to the supervisor what they do with that. And then the employee can always talk to their HR generalist for help ahead of time. The generalist can help them pull together talking points. The generalist can also role play a conversation if that would make them comfortable, any of those things. And then the employee can start informal, and if they're not satisfied, they can move to formal, or they can just jump straight to the formal problem solving. So some of you may have seen before, we used to have a formal process that required employees to kind of work their way up the chain of command. We recently revised that so that now the employee can go straight to the decision maker, really to just sort of save time in the process. So if the employee wants to go the formal route, they need to submit the request in writing to their department or office's decision maker. The employee should clearly describe the problem or the concern. So they need to outline what it is they have a problem with, and then state whatever remedy they're seeking. So the employee could be asking, hey, can you just remove this corrective action? I think this is unfair. But the employee can also just pick out pieces of it. So I have seen problem-solving requests where the employee agrees overall, yep, I deserve a corrective action. I have not been doing a good job. But there might be a piece of it they don't agree with. Like maybe the supervisor says, you were an hour late to work on June 7th. And the employee's like, no, I wasn't. I want to make sure that gets corrected for the record. I wasn't late and I can prove it. And, I was sitting at my desk at that time. You just got that wrong. So they could just ask that one or two sentences be removed. And then it's up to the decision maker to decide whether or not to modify or remove whatever the issue is that the employee has. So the decision maker, once they get that request in writing, will meet with the employee to hear their perspective and then consult with HR. The decision maker consults with HR, and then they will ultimately make a decision on it. Okay. So the next piece I'll talk about and just give kind of a quick overview of is our adverse actions process. So what is an adverse action? Anytime that the county is looking to suspend someone without pay, involuntarily demote them, or dismiss or terminate them from employment, that's considered to be an adverse action. And if that's the case, as long as the employee has passed their probation, we have to go through the adverse action process to impose any of one of those three things on an employee. So it doesn't apply to probationary employees. Probationary employees can be dismissed there at will, and that's kind of the point of probation. But once you've passed probation, there's this adverse action process. Adverse action is really for severe conduct issues. So let's say an employee punched another employee at work. That's something that we wouldn't start with a corrective action and tell them, hey, don't be punching your fellow employees. We would go straight to an adverse action and say, hey, this is a really serious issue. And then adverse actions can also be used where we have gone through the corrective action process, usually a couple of times, and addressed whatever the ongoing performance or conduct issue is with the employee. And if it's still an issue that's not getting resolved, even though we've given it our best effort, we've given the employee resources, given them some time to try and correct things. If we're at that point where it's not getting resolved, then we'll go to adverse action. And then it's important to note, under county policy, only the decision maker can take adverse action. So a supervisor can't do it. So I occasionally have employees saying, hey, if my supervisor's mad at me, can they just walk in the door and fire me one day next week? And they can't. So that's important to know as well. Only a decision maker has the authority to dismiss somebody from employment. So we have another process map. It looks pretty similar to the last one. The process is generally the same as corrective action, but essentially the supervisor or even the decision maker will reach out to their department or office's assigned HR generalist. Except for those really once-off, really severe situations, typically the generalist will be aware of the issue because you've been working on it with the supervisor over an extended period of time. There may be a couple of corrective actions, some conversations, things like that. So the supervisor or decision maker will reach out to the generalist. And then just like last time, they will have a discussion to determine if adverse action is appropriate. So they'll be talking again about, have you talked to the employee? How many times have you issued corrective actions? What have you done to try and help the employee? What resources have you provided? And so they'll decide if adverse action is appropriate or if something else might be an appropriate response. And then if they decide to move forward with adverse action, the generalist will send the template to the supervisor or decision maker. Again, the template is in Google Docs, so we'll collaborate back and forth on Google Docs. And then the generalist and decision maker or supervisor work together to create a document that they are comfortable with. And then once they have come up with a draft that they like, they will send it to the county attorney's office for their review and approval. And then just like last time, if there are any changes recommended by the county attorney's office, the supervisor will need to accept those changes recommended. And then the supervisor will present the pre-adverse action notice to the employee. So this isn't really generally a back and forth conversation. It's really just the supervisor presenting the notice. Quite often we'll have employees who want to argue or talk about the notice. And the supervisor at that point needs to tell the employee, this isn't the place for you to discuss that. We will have a meeting later that will be specifically for that purpose. This is just me delivering this notice to you. And then we usually set a meeting. So the pre-adverse action process is issuing the notice, then it goes to a meeting that is scheduled with the decision maker and the employee. We typically set those about 7 to 10 days after the notice is presented to the employee. The reason is that the employee can bring an attorney to these meetings if they want to represent them. So we want to give them some time to get an attorney if they want to, or also to gather together their thoughts and any information that they feel like they will need to share at that meeting. And then we don't want to schedule it too far out because we don't want the employee essentially sitting on pins and needles wondering what's happening with their employment. So we try to find that kind of happy medium window in between. And then the decision maker has the option to put the employee on paid leave pending the meeting. So the decision maker, there are some departments that will just sort of as a matter of course put employees on leave. And then there are some that will just put them out, if the employee might be retaliatory towards other employees or overly disruptive in the workplace. Maybe they'll be sort of intimidating and treating other employees negatively, especially if it's the result of employees complaining about that employee. So if there's some concern that the employee might be disruptive or retaliatory, we'll put them out on paid leave and just give them that time to be out and prepare. And then they'll come back for the meeting. And then supervisors can also consider whether to cut off access to county systems. So again, if the employee might use county systems to be disruptive or harass other employees, we may cut off access in that case. And then if the employee needs access for some reason or another, they can contact their HR generalist to, maybe if they need an email to present or something, they can meet with the HR generalist to get that information. Okay. So in the adverse action meeting, the participants will be the employee, the decision maker for their department or office, and then the HR generalist who acts as the facilitator for the meeting. So we sit in and just record it and facilitate the conversation. In most cases, the supervisor will also be there. And then if the employee chooses to bring an attorney, then the county attorney or someone from his office will also attend. So what can you expect in this meeting? And I'll mention first too, before I get into that, we generally hold those meetings in the HR office at 200 West Oak, basically, again, to protect employees' privacy. Because, you know, if an employee comes walking into a conference room in their office with their decision maker and HR, then people start to talk and say, huh, what's going on there? So we usually have that at HR just to protect privacy for employees. So the meeting is really the employee's opportunity to tell their side of the story to the decision maker. So typically up until that point, the decision maker, in most cases, probably has heard from the supervisor or maybe a manager in between about the situation with the employee. They typically haven't heard the employee's side of the story. So this is a chance for the employee to sit face to face with the decision maker and tell them their perspective and their side of things. Like I mentioned, the HR generalist will record it and facilitate the meeting. We really just kind of ask the employee multiple times if they've had a chance to share everything that they want and make sure that the decision maker isn't asking inappropriate questions or the employee isn't going into inappropriate territory or anything like that. The employee can be represented by an attorney, like I said, and then the decision maker typically will just ask questions. They're not there to have something to say. The department has kind of put their perspective in that pre-adverse action notice. So the decision maker is just there to sort of inquire more, ask clarifying questions, whatever they need to understand the employee's perspective. And when the decision maker goes away from that meeting, sometimes they need to do some follow-up. So they may need to talk to other employees or look for a particular document or email or things like that. And then the employee can bring any information that they think is helpful or important for the decision maker to know to understand their perspective. So there might be documents, there might be emails, anything like that. And then the decision maker does not make a decision at that meeting. We always really encourage the decision maker to think about it overnight and to sleep on it, because that's always a good way to just get a whole perspective and to let all the information sort of sink in and marinate. So they don't make a decision at that meeting. So some of the possible outcomes. So the three things that I mentioned at the beginning of this section, termination of employment, suspension without pay of a few hours to several days, or involuntary demotion. The decision maker can also decide, I don't think it's quite serious enough for one of those adverse actions. I'm just going to issue a corrective action. They can do that. They can also go a more informal route, like, you know what, we're just going to make a journal note and perform. It's not a huge deal, but we still want to make sure the employee is aware that this is an issue and it doesn't continue. Or the decision maker can decide, I don't really think there's anything to this, and just return the employee back to work. So after the meeting, the decision maker will issue a written decision. They have a template that they use from HR, similar process. They run it through the generalist, run it through county attorney's office. And then the decision maker needs to make sure that it gets to the employee. So in a way that they will receive it and that we can be confident that they received it, because we want to make sure that the employee is getting that notice and getting it timely. So some decision makers, it's really up to them, but some of them prefer to sit down and meet with the employee face to face and just present the notice and tell them about the decision. Some decision makers prefer to do like email with a read receipt or send it via FedEx or something like that. Those are all fine. It's up to the decision maker to just sort of set a process for their department and be consistent. And then just a quick note, in general, employees terminated from employment are generally ineligible for rehire. There can be a conversation between the department and the generalist. So if, for example, an employee wasn't able to keep up with a workflow in a job that's, maybe has heavy workload, but the employee would be perfectly good in another role in the county, they might just make them ineligible for rehire in their department. So that's a discussion for the generalist if that's a concern. Okay, so that's the basics of the process. Like I mentioned earlier, grievances are sort of paired with those adverse actions. So if an employee does not like the outcome of an adverse action decision, and the decision was an adverse action, meaning it was involuntary demotion, suspension without pay, or termination of employment, the employee can essentially appeal that decision by filing a grievance. There's just sort of a narrow category of reasons they can file it. So just because the employee doesn't like it or disagrees with it isn't reason enough. There has to be something where maybe the decision maker committed an error in applying county policy, or maybe they didn't apply county policy. Maybe the decision maker didn't consider relevant evidence that they should have, or they considered totally irrelevant evidence. Or if the decision notice just doesn't adequately establish the reason for the decision. So any of those cases, they can file a grievance. So the person who reviews them or makes a decision on the grievance is ultimately the HR director. So the grievance must be submitted in writing to the HR director. You also need to submit it to the HR generalist and the decision maker, outlining why the employee objects to the decision. It should be filed within 7 days after the employee receives that notice. So this is another reason why it's important to make sure that the employee actually does receive the notice, and we can show when that time was. So the employee has 7 days after that to file their grievance. And then finally, the HR director will issue a written decision addressing all of the reasons that were raised in that particular grievance. All right. So I have some examples or scenarios that we'll walk through, and I'm going to raise some polls and see what you all think about this. So let me get this going here. I'm going to escape out of here so I can read my scenarios here. Sorry. Here we go. All right, so I will let you vote on this and tell me what you think. So in this first scenario, we have Adam is a supervisor in a small county office where he works with 2 other staff. County staff from other departments come in to use their office and work site occasionally, including staff from another department who have to do maintenance. When other county staff visit the office, Adam's often rude to them. He tells them they're incompetent. He gets angry with anyone who doesn't immediately pick up after themselves. What should Adam's supervisor do when he gets a complaint from several departments who've had their own staff complaining about Adam's behavior? So number 1, should they just make some notes in Adam's supervisory file and not discuss it with him? Should they talk with Adam about the complaints, or should they issue him a corrective action? So go ahead and vote. Yeah, it looks like we have almost 100% and all the same answer. All right, I'll go ahead and share the results. So it looks like all of you who voted all said they should talk with Adam about the complaints. And that's exactly right. We shouldn't just be making notes and not talking about it with Adam, because it's obviously an ongoing issue. And then it's not quite at the point where we should issue a corrective action because the conversation hasn't happened yet. So we need to start with having that conversation with Adam about what's been going on. And then if it continues, it might be appropriate for a corrective action. All right, great job. All right. I will launch our next poll. So in our next scenario, we have Bobby, who works in a customer-facing role with heavy customer service duties. Often when she doesn't agree with a customer's request, she says, "No, that's stupid." When 2 customers complain to Bobby's supervisor, what should Bobby's supervisor do? Should the supervisor ignore the complaints unless they receive more? Should the supervisor make some notes in Bobby's supervisory notes or file? Should they discuss the complaints with Bobby? Or should they issue a corrective action to Bobby? So I'll let you go ahead and vote. All right. So it looks like we have a few saying issue corrective action. We have a few saying notes in the supervisory notes, and the biggest chunk saying discuss it with Bobby. All right. So on this one, I would say y'all got this right. Definitely don't ignore the complaints. And then from there, it kind of depends on your judgment and how this has been handled in the past. But potentially make some notes in Bobby's supervisory notes. Her behavior is severe enough that I think we need to discuss that with Bobby too, so that we hopefully nip that behavior in the bud and don't let it continue. So you could kind of do making some notes in her file and then also discuss it with her. That's probably what I would recommend doing. I don't know that it's quite at the corrective action level. If this behavior hasn't been discussed with Bobby, I would certainly hope that telling customers something is stupid is, not good behavior. Hopefully she's aware of that, but we at least need to make her aware of that. So unless there's some other circumstances going on, I'd probably just have a conversation with her and tell her this needs to stop immediately. All right, good job. And we have our last scenario. So in this scenario, Courtney supervises a small team. She often tells her team members that employees on another team in their department are lazy and that those employees and their supervisor, quote, suck at their jobs. How should Courtney's supervisor handle this situation? Should the supervisor ignore it since she's not being rude directly to others, so it's not really an issue? Should they talk with Courtney and explain that this is not appropriate behavior for a supervisor? Or should they issue a corrective action? All right, so it looks like we have a couple for corrective action. A few more. All right, I'll go ahead and end it. So it looks like the biggest chunk are saying talk with Courtney. And I think in most cases, that's probably going to be the most appropriate thing, depending on how long this has been going on. It's probably important to just talk to Courtney, document a conversation with her and say, this is really not appropriate for you to be discussing other employees like this. It is pretty significant behavior from Courtney to be saying these types of things to her staff about another team. So it's possible a corrective action could be appropriate just based on what's been happening in the department, what prior precedents are, things like that. So probably I would go with talking to Courtney, but it may rise to the level of corrective action. All right. Great. Go ahead and close our poll. So that's about all I have for you. Excuse me. I'll get to some questions. So if there are questions, I'll answer those. If you have any questions, please type those into the chat so that we can answer them for you. And then I'm going to go here. So these are the names of all the HR generalists. So if you need to know who yours is, you can look at the website or you can just reach out to any of us. Sarah Witherell is the generalist for Human Services, and Keish Baggin at the bottom is the generalist for Sheriff, since those are our two biggest offices. And then the other generalists will all carry multiple departments and offices. So do we have any questions, Jen?
At this point, not so far.
Okay.
Maybe give it a few more minutes.
Yep, I'll give you all just a few minutes. So if any questions occurred to you along the way, please feel free to just type those in the chat and ask them. If you don't want to ask them to the larger group, you're also completely welcome to reach out to me or any of the HR generalists to ask those questions. So you're welcome to email us or call us, whatever you're comfortable with.
Marie is wondering if Nicole Berg is the generalist for ASD.
She is not. So Nicole was until fairly recently. The beginning of the year, we reassigned all of CJA to Evan Scott. I know a lot of people really love Nicole and she's awesome, but she's our inclusion administrator and we pulled her out of generalist duties so that she can do some more of her inclusion work. All right, any other questions anyone has?
I think we're good.
All right. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And I hope you all have a great day.